Hey, we're live a couple of seconds early. You are here at Nighttime Logic. I'm Daniel Braum. I'm your host. I'm here with Paul Tremblay. We'll introduce him in just a second. Nighttime Logic is the part of a story that is felt but is not consciously processed. It's also the name of our show. Welcome. Today is Thursday, August 29th, 2024. It's a late summer's day here in New York. The heat and humidity broke, and it's actually a bearable day. And I'm here just talking about a couple of horror movies. How on point with acclaimed author Paul Tremblay. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that. Yeah, the
Great to see
weather is
you.
broke. The weather broke here too, which is nice for sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's good. Let me introduce you for any of you if you do not know. Paul Tremblay has won the Bram Stoker, the British Fantasy, and the Massachusetts Book Awards, and is the nationally best-selling author of The Beast You Are, The Pallbearers Club, Survivor Song, Growing Things, and Other Stories, Disappearance at Devil's Rock, A Head Full of Ghosts, and the crime novels, which I just picked up this year, The Little Sleep and No Sleep Till Wonderland. His novel, The Cabin at the End of the World, was adapted into the Universal Pictures film, Knock at the Cabin. He lives outside Boston with his family, and his latest book is Horror Movie, a novel. So welcome. You anticipated my next question. I was going to ask how the summer day is, how the humidity is bearable by you, but we'll just say congratulations on the success of Horror Movie, and
Thank you.
I know it's been a busy summer, so thank you for taking the time to come on the show. I
Yeah,
really
yeah.
appreciate it. And it's really wonderful. It's wonderful to congratulate you on the success of Horror Movie, and it's also just wonderful to say that you've had a string of successes of some really successful books for a bunch of summers, maybe pushing a decade now. So congratulations on that. That's just really great to see.
Thank you.
I'm really especially excited to have you on the show because I love your kind of stories. I love the stories that play with and balance the tension between the psychological and the supernatural. And your work always has that in play. And there's there's like a ton of stories, works I could ask you about, but I'm going to be disciplined and I'm going to keep the focus on our movie
All
today,
right.
and I'm really excited to do so. So just to all the viewers out there, spoiler warning. We're definitely going to talk about spoilers in Horror Movie, but so the first concept I want to throw at you, Paul, is so you've done like a wonderful job with the book. It operates for me. It's operating well on different levels. Um, I think all stories before they're doing something else, they have to entertain. And this story entertains. It draws you in, keeps you interested in the story that's unfolding in two different points in time, and yet it still flows really, really smooth. So um, that's easier said than done. That's really
Thank you.
perfectly done. So I wanted to say that because that's just like this is one of those like don't try it at home kind of things I would say to people. Let me say like to write. Oh yeah, imitate your favorite writer to get started. But I'm like like unless her hands, I could see so many places where this would hurt. But it's remarkable just about how smooth and fast paced
I,
it goes.
well, I
While
appreciate that. Thank you.
um, and it's also in addition to just being so it has to hit that first level. Like you have to enjoy the book and be carried along, but it's really a book of the moment. It's hit that zeitgeist of being a book about horror movies, and perhaps it's something more. Perhaps it's about horror movies and what they are to us, and there seems to be of the moment right now. The first thing that stood out to me when I read the book was the voice of the main character, the weird guy, the tall kid. We get him in the present scene. We get him in the now of the story because the story it goes back two places in time. He's a guy in his early 50s, and he's telling us about something that's gone wrong in the early 90s, and that is a horror movie that it's real infamous now. And we get these choice little bits of dialogue from him. So in addition to just nailing that voice, he has like these little, he is like almost commenting on his dialogue with these real fatalistic little conclusions, like when there's a mask in the movie and like he is telling us things, but he's also saying like these little things like, oh, all masks are mirrors, you know, like these deeper things. But we also get dark conclusions, and we're knowing that clearly something has gone awful and we haven't seen it yet, and it's always building towards that. So the first question is how did you nail that voice? How much of perhaps you did you draw upon to get the tall kid in his now iteration?
Yeah. Well, thank you first for all the kind words. I'm honored and I appreciate it.
It's really great, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, you know, the thin kid, it's funny. So I'll say in general, like certainly because you're introduced to him, as you mentioned, we're introduced to him in the presence, right? He's talking to, or talking about an interview he's having with a producer. So the thin kid in his early 50s is sort of very cynical, snarky, uh, even a little cruel, if not quick-witted too.
Also insightful. You know, he does have some
for sure. And for me, like once I sort of hit on like that part of the voice, I thought it was a fun juxtaposition to have him, like introduce him talking this way now, where he seems like, you know, he's at least presenting himself as he knows more than at least the other people that he's talking to, not necessarily everybody else, you know, but has sort of a confidence, a world weary, you know, Gen X confidence about him. But then to sort of like have him narrate, you know, about this movie when he was 23, 24, and very much as described, like a vulnerable, almost like naive, you know, new adult. And to have him sort of, you know, you get to bounce back and forth between, you know, between those two parts of his life. You know, so hopefully, even if subconsciously, you know, I wanted the reader to think about, well, geez, well, why, why is he like this now compared to, you know, how we're introduced to him, you know, when he's in his early 20s, because he's clearly not very confident, certainly not confident about his physical appearance, because, you know, he thinks he's, you know, way too thin, you know, and things like that. So that was like an initial sort of juxtaposition of sort of the thin kid, who he was and who he is, like 30 years apart.
Yeah, the two voices that really comes across, whether it's operating to prepare just to prepare the field subconsciously to the reader, or it also really helps. You're never lost in time, and that's from the voice, and that's from the voice, and also we'll get to it later. You also see the progression of how as he starts to change, and not just from adult young adult to as there are some perhaps psychological or supernatural changes happening. You see that in voice too, and that's a really delight. It's really fun. He's also looking back at 90s music, something he's sharing. We get him. He's looking back. We even go back in time where he's sharing about music and films with Valentina, who is the screenwriter of this horror movie. And yeah, one of the initial things was like just talking about some of the bands. And there's one point where they when you're describing the two of them, they talk about it's a list of musicians. I think maybe it was U2 and Metallica, but it was the list. It was the list of sellouts, and it was like the biggest crime was sellout. And I thought that, you know, looking back as I was writing my questions, I was like, you know, that was just thought it was a really smooth way of doing it, of introducing the notion of authenticity and introducing the notion of self. Was that something you were putting in intentionally in there? I know I've read some interviews with you where you say you really trust in the subconscious part of the writing process.
Yeah, in this case, it was certainly more purposeful. You know, once I knew, you know, in some ways, like the whole story was sort of inspired by hearing people talk about what had happened on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre sort of set, and I wanted to do a you know, if not, you know, I guess a cursed film, or at least this film that was made but didn't, you know, make it to completion. And I couldn't do it in the 70s because it was too long ago. But I needed a time period where, you know, there weren't union rules in place to protect everybody necessarily. So it was like, oh, once it was like
Okay.
once it was like the early '90s, I'm like, that's perfect, because I could continue to scratch sort
Were
of
you
the itch of.
were you considering landing on the 70s at one point in
No,
the
but I mean, just because it was the initial movie, there was no way because he would be too old. Like I didn't want to have like
Okay.
a 20 and 70-year-old. I wanted
Got it.
it was much more natural for me to talk about like the '90s and and sort of further explore because the novel before this one, the Paul Bearers Club, is very much about sort of not all Gen Xers experience because I mean that's ludicrous to talk about anyone from any sort of generation as having the same experience. But in Gen X, there's very specific pockets of culture and subculture, and I was definitely like an active participant of what I would call like the alternative music sort of Gen X thing that was pretty big in the early '90s. Um, and that idea of being a sellout was like I just remember that being so not only not important but like foundational. It was like a part of your personality. It was like those at least among my friends and the people that I knew that'd be like the worst thing that you could be called. Like the idea that you are in some way inauthentic, and that's what I took it to mean that in some way your motives for doing something weren't genuine.
And
Um,
especially with music, that seemed, at least for me, that seemed
yeah.
to really crystallize around music. And even my favorite musicians, like around that time, I'm just thinking about The Cure. I was so into The Cure. And at
Mhm.
the time, they had an album that came out in that time, and I didn't get it. And like the notion of something that was so important to you that could be
Yeah.
sellout was, if you haven't experienced it, you really can't underestimate just
Yeah.
where that really. So I think that was you were mining really potent ground.
Yeah, I mean, as a purity test, nothing is healthy as a purity test, frankly,
Yeah, not as a
and
purity test,
certainly
just
not in this case.
just as a
Yeah, yeah,
touchstone
yeah,
to give the verisimilitude of the
sure.
character.
But but at the same time, like as a reflection of just me growing up too, I kind of think we could use like maybe a watered down or a healthier dose of the idea of a sellout. I think now, because to me, like a lot of the book was a little bit of my exploration of like the price of art, like what's the price?
Yeah,
What's worth it? And what's
yeah,
the line that you're willing to cross? Especially, for me as a novelist, I don't get to collaborate at all, really. Working with an editor is not quite the same level of
yeah.
collaboration as making a film or being in a band, right? So I was fascinated about the collaborative aspect, and again, the price. Like, is it worth it? Like I sort of half joke, even something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They took so many chances and not only like financially, but physically and mental health wise, they definitely stepped over lines. But because no one was killed, I kind of think it was worth it. Maybe that makes me a terrible person, but
Yeah, yeah,
I think
definitely.
that's just a fascinating thing to think about. I don't know. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that. I'm just going to say it so I don't forget the two things I want to come back to. I want to come back to the talk about cursed films, and I want to come
Mhm.
back to that Texas Chainsaw inspiration. But now that you mention it, like about saying, yeah, looking at it now from this point, I'm really glad you said that because I remember being a kid. And I remember when Stephen King first had his first run of movies, like his first bunch of like movies, and they just some of them were bad, some of them were good,
Mhm.
and it was before the internet, of course. I think you're the same generation. I don't remember which book it was, but he communicated with us, his faithful readers or dear readers, whatever, in the front of his books. And I remember in the front of one of those books, like I was like in day camp. I must have been 14 or 13. And I remember like my counselor was like reading it, and he was saying, King was saying like, hey, like, dear readers, like, you may have heard, yeah, I made like maybe it was like 80 million or some insane amount of money. And he was like, can you be happy for me? I remember him saying, like,
Huh.
like the book still exists, but I just want to let you know, like, some of these movies are good and some of them are bad, but this deal has ensured like the prosperity of my family now for generations. And
Mm.
I look at that, I always remember that. And I remember looking at it differently as a kid. And I remember looking at it now, like now I'm like, man, I'm so glad that he's set, and I'm like, and I'm also like, I guess not to say that I care less, but yeah, I could care less. Like selling out suddenly means something different to me as a 50-year-old artist than
Yeah.
it did as a teenage artist, where that was where it was not. I guess I'm saying, yeah, perhaps it's not the. It's still a crime, but perhaps yeah, it's more of a nuanced crime.
Yeah, and even like just because something does well doesn't necessarily mean that like it quote unquote sold out. Obviously, I mean, which is obviously what you're saying when you're comparing, the Stephen King book. I sort of like the idea. Someone had said this to me recently um, about like bending the public to you. That's sort of always been my goal as a writer. So what that means to me is like, listen, I've been very fortunate. One of the most lucky writers in the world. And part of the reason why I've kept my writing job for so long, well, partly is just neuroses left over from my parents who always used to fight about money. So I never wanted that to be a problem. So there's that. But like I always looked at my writing job, which I enjoy. I enjoy teaching, but for me, it's also been like this artistic. I view it as an artistic safety net. Like if someone were to say, no, you can't do this in this book, otherwise we're not going to sell it, I'd be like, well, I'll look for somebody else or start over again kind of thing. I mean, which I kind of had to do
And that's
twice.
easier
Actually,
said.
It is easier said than like, my 2 crime novels didn't do so well. They didn't want my third. So I was like, all right, we were both like parting of ways. And then I sort of went back to the smaller press and, was fortunate to land with the editor that I have now with A Head Full of Ghosts. And I continue to be incredibly fortunate because I've never once had a conversation about like, hey, you have to make a happier ending, or you can't do this to this character in the cabinet at the end of the world, or you can't have an ambiguous ending. None of that has ever happened. And I count myself very lucky. So again, I'm not saying that my stuff is the best stuff in the world. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that my stuff is my stuff. I'm very proud of that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense. You should be proud of it. I think we're all proud of you, your fans and your colleagues. And take it. I mean, Paul's really lucky that he's never had that. But I know for a fact that people up and down the chain, from people who are just in the small press level like me, or people up in the chain from the big 5, they have those conversations. Those more writers than if not all of them, will say, yeah, change. I get the one of like the ambiguous, like, oh, we love this story. Now let's just take everything that's ambiguous out of it. Oh, yeah, and I'm with you. I'm in it for obviously, especially at the small press level. I'm not in it for the money, so it's not easy. It does take nuance to in a lot of projects that I had to walk away from because of that. And it's a thing. And there's a price. Speaking of the price, one of the most terrible prices is a movie that came up when I was thinking about this book was, and we're getting back to now the cursed films or the cursed objects. Now I'm thinking about The Crow from the 1990s. And the price of that was the loss of, the tragic loss of Brandon Lee.
Yes.
And then the other movie that comes to mind is, the Blair Witch Project and its sort of partner, the documentary, The Curse of the Blair Witch. Did you see that, The Curse of the Blair Witch?
Yes.
Did you see those coming down the pipe, both those movies, like in the early 90s?
I did. Oh yeah, no, I was there. I was there the first week for the Blair Witch Project, and saw it with a friend. I didn't tell him anything about it. He was sort of gullible. He was like, "Was that real?" I'm like, "No, it was not real." But yes, like I remember watching The Curse of the Blair Witch on the
but I was gullible,
channel.
man. I watched The Curse of the Blair Witch and I'm like, it's got to be fake because it's on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Yeah.
But I was like, it did just enough to accomplish, to raise doubt in me and to have me on, edge.
I had read about the film somewhere. Geez, I think it was some glossy magazine mentioned it. Maybe it might have been Rolling Stone with just like a little preview. I can't remember. So I did know that this was a film, and even though it was being presented this way. So, not to cast aspersions to my friend Walter or to you, who in the moment with knowing nothing thought it was could be real. Yeah.
Hey, that I think that was also that's also sort of the fun of it too, and
yeah, absolutely.
It just speaks to the notion of the times, whereas you can't really. I mean, how many times can you play that trick or play that not just calling it a trick, use that device.
Right.
I wanted to, I didn't have time to, so I'm so curious. I think you're referring to Walter Darnell, a film critic who I think he runs a podcast or a YouTube show, and I didn't get a chance to watch
Walter
it.
Chow, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and John, and John, sorry, just to Walter Chow is
Like,
the critic and John Darnielle is the author. Yeah.
that's why I
Yeah.
kind of blended. I made them into a
You
bromance.
made
Like
them
I
into yeah.
Brangelina'd them out or
Yeah.
something there. So I apologize to
No problem.
those two guys. But yeah, I'm really curious because the Texas Chainsaw, and I was also reading an interview by you. I had a similar experience in Texas Chainsaw. I only watched it very recently, maybe in pandemic times, because
Yeah.
I'm a little averse to gore, and on its reputation, I stayed away from it for a long time because of its reputation. And like you mentioned in a different interview, it's not the most gory of movie. I found it to be a movie, and its power is its violation of expectation. And this is a movie that came in the early 70s. So a lot of horror movies came after it, but and a lot came before. But I think the power of Texas Chainsaw, at least for me, was not I expected this like awful gore fest that was going to ruin me, but I was like, oh wow, it's actually, not to over intellectualize it, but it's one of those movies that that really changed like expectations of what could be done or what is safe in a horror movie. So like in one way, it's like the best there ever was, and sort of like, like everything else that came downstream was watered down. And I'm mentioning that because similar things I think can be said of horror movie. Like how did you play with pace and expectation in the novel, Paul?
Yeah. So it's funny. Like part of this is just me being obstinate contrarian. I don't like the word pace. I don't love the word pace. Like I fully like I understand what people are saying when they say pace, but I think too many people when they say pace, that means, and I know this isn't the case for you, but for too many readers when they say, oh, the pace was slow, that means there wasn't explosions or stabbings in every page. Like, or in other words, it means there wasn't like a ton of plot.
Right.
So I honestly don't think in terms of pace. What I think in terms of is just a real interrogation of every bit that I put into the novel. Like I have to be able to explain to myself why the purpose of this thing, why it has to be there. And if I can't give myself a good reason as to why it's there, then it's got to go. You know, but otherwise like pace, etc. is really just goes by, for me, it's like by feel. Like I've never finished something like, I have to make this faster or slower, with maybe the exception
Well, it has a great feel then. And I see what you're saying. Like we could talk about pace, like even, and
I didn't mean to like
I'm
sidetrack us with pace, but
oh no,
yeah,
it's a great sidetrack. Because I'm thinking of like maybe this is a Stephen King episode, because like Salem's Lot is maybe the classic iteration of what you call a slow burn on the pace. And I just mentioned that because like some people love it and want it, and some people are like, not for me. But I think in you saying that you delivered in horror movie like the mosaic or the distilled bits, and they're all going to the conflict. They're all furthering it has a good feel, and that I guess it has a trajectory or a sense of motion to it. That's why I was thinking
motion. I like that idea better. I like that word better, motion. I did sort of imagine at a certain point, because actually I didn't do a lot of pre-planning for this book compared to other ones. I kind of I didn't pre-plot it like I've done some of my other books, but I kept a lot of notes as I went. But I got to a point where I sort of imagined like the first a couple 100 pages or 180 pages we're setting up all these different traps. And then for me, my head, the last 100 pages is everything springing together. And hopefully, the motion, as you described, I like that. I'm gonna start using that, feels that way. Yeah. But honestly, like a lot of the book is just me trying to like, hey, this is the kind of horror story that I like. And even to go back to like the Blair Witch, explore that, like the thing about, because cursed film books have been everywhere the last few years and people are just really fascinated by it, myself included. And the growth of fandom in all sort of areas of pop culture, part of the book was exploring sort of like, why do we like this piece of art so much that even if it's a piece of art that depicts terrible things happening, why do we secretly want that, or not so secretly want it to bleed over into real life somehow, just a little bit? I mean, that's the way as a fan that I feel about like some of my books and movies. And it's just weird. I think very human reaction to art that you love so much. You kind of want it to be real, even though, no, that would be awful if it's real. So I kind of was hoping horror movie would bleed over a little bit into that sort of feeling and have the thin kid sort of play with it.
There is a real energy there. I haven't the slightest idea other than saying that it's a real phenomenon, and there's a real energy to it in terms of the surging pop. I think it's always been popular, but the the popularity of true crime and people's interest in it, and then maybe it's just a merger of like this. We're gonna give you an entree of horror with a side order of true crime, and maybe it's just scarier. It's just scarier that way, like the things that. But I just don't know. I do know that it's that cursed things are just cool. And you have a really cool backstory of the mask, and the cool cursed object thing dovetailed into one of the things that I always look for in a book and I always thought was cool. So there's this cool mask, and there's you have this cool backstory for there's a lot of ambiguity about whether it is a cursed object or not,
or even if it's an actual backstory or not, like maybe they're just making it up. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Yes. All of that. And that was so smooth because there's so many places that it was delivered so smooth. And for me, I'm always like, oh yeah, I'm the guy that's gonna bite on the blood. Everyone's like, is that real? So I'm biting on all the directions that Paul put out in the story. I love that. Yeah, is it okay? Is it a curse mask? And we begin to see substantial things where we can hang our hat on that. Like, oh wow, this is happening. That's totally cursed. But then we can also see the other direction of like, oh, but this is a story about masks. And and this is a story about psychology, and we get that side as well. So I love stories where two reasonable minds could say, no, this is a story about a cursed mask, and another reasonable mind could be like, no, this is a story about this psychological experience, or maybe both. So I just absolutely I love that. I tend to call that intentional ambiguity. I tend to call it sometimes Aikman-esque, or adjacent to Aikman-esque. So tell us what you were thinking about the masks. And first I'll ask you to tell us about the mask and the non-supernatural element. How does that mask play with the psychological things that you're doing with those characters?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess first, I had to figure out what the horror movie was going to be. And I don't remember exactly what was sort of thing, but the what if was like, oh, so we're talking spoilers. Like the thing that started the movie itself was, oh, I'm going to have this really sort of art house thing where these kids basically train a slasher. That was like the opening idea. I was like, oh, these teenagers are going to create a slasher of their own. And then sort of like Frankenstein, or the movie Frankenstein, not necessarily the novel Frankenstein, the creature goes amok kind of thing afterwards. So it was like, once I thought it was like slasher or slasher adjacent, I wanted a mask, but my sort of horror introduction and upbringing as a kid was all people in masks and monster suits, like Creature from the Black Lagoon and Godzilla, and even goofy stuff like Reptilogus. That probably wasn't a suit, that was just a terrible puppet. But no, so I really loved that idea of the mask, and I wanted it to be as malleable as possible, and you describe it but never describe it in too much detail, so hopefully every reader had a different image of what the mask might be. So I mean, Cleo as a character and a screenwriter talks about the mask, same with the Thin Kid too. And I don't know, it was kind of fun just to be able to write about why I'm attracted to sort of, you even talked about being attracted to cursed objects. In horror, to me, there's two, a push and pull thing of, there is the awe of possibility in horror. It's oh, there's a cursed object. I mean, that means there's something supernatural happening. There's a weird, oh, that's so cool. Just there's something beyond our everyday that, there's that part of horror.
Yeah. It's the sense of wonder.
The sense of wonder,
it's not the gore. It's that sense of wonder and, dark wonder about it.
But then but then the terror and the horrible stuff kicks you in the gut, right? So there's the two parts.
And that's why it's not. I guess that's why it's not fantasy, right? I mean, right? Fantasy is where we can just kind of revel in that, and then I guess maybe we as horror writers, there can be a tension of both of those side by side. I don't know. I'm just trying to think why do I like? There's been a we were talking about oddity a little bit. Then we
Mhm.
were talking about was it call? Oh no, was it not Call Me by My Name? Talk to Me, Talk to Me.
I
Dude,
haven't seen that
what?
yet. I need to see it. Yeah.
All right, so I won't spoil. Yeah,
Yeah.
why there's just like fun things about them because maybe there's rules or there's cursed, but so yeah, the other thing was like you could also look at horror movie, and I didn't expect it. Like that horror movie could be a cursed object story, which could sort of be. It's so I'm like, wow, is this in the lineage of a monkey paw sort
Hmm.
of for a story where we have a cursed object that is I'm calling them a non-human. It's an object centered story where the object it's a story of the object, which maybe ultimately, if taken to its push and pulls on both ends of the story, they've been there before the characters and they're going to outlive the characters. And two of my favorite stories like that is the unlikely titled. It's called Some Zombie Contingency Plans by Kelly
By
Link.
Kelly Link,
The
yes.
one with the painting, the
Yeah.
sort of a Chris painting. And there's one I'm not sure if you've come across it yet, but it's coming out in a collection from Brian Evanson, the great Brian Evanson. It's coming out in his Good Night, Sleep Tight
I
next
have
month.
read. Yeah.
Untitled Cloud of Blood, the painting
Yeah.
story.
Hmm.
Another. So yeah, there's two cursed object stories. Yeah, I was just gonna say, you're already answering. I just wanted to throw a question there. I was saying,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's the joy of a cursed object story? And I interrupted your answer with that
No,
untimely.
no, no. I mean, I think I already sort of like mostly talked about like, because there is that like awe that, we talked about the awe or wonder of horror, like that part of it, right? It's just the, it's that itch to press the button, you can't, even though a horrible thing's going to happen after you press it, you're still like, oh, you're still
Hey,
drawn to it.
speaking of that cursed mask, you want to read a little bit? I think you're going to read about that mask.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll,
Your solo screen here.
okay.
Let me know when you're done. We'll bring you back.
Okay. So I'm going to read probably about 7 minutes, just so you know, from the
Got it.
4th chapter, where the thin kid is being pitched the movie by Valentina and Cleo in 1993, before they started filming. And Cleo and Valentina are introducing the mask, that the thin kid's going to have to wear on set. And I have to change glasses to reading glasses. Sorry. All right. Shoot. I have my page marked. There we go. Cleo passed the mask over to me. The latex was cold and clammy, or maybe it was my hands that were cold and clammy. Cleo fidgeted as my fingers inspected and explored the mask. Okay, I assumed I would be playing some sort of creature, given that they told me I didn't have many or any lines of dialogue. The mask looked ridiculous and fake, something you might pick up in a department store before Halloween. I wanted to ask if they were joking again, but I didn't want to risk hurting anyone's feelings. I thought about trying it on, but I got the sense Cleo would have stopped me from doing so with her fork. Whereas previously she'd sat in a sunken slouch, now she was curled over the table ready to strike. Valentina said, "Yeah, it looks underwhelming now, but it's disturbing as fuck when someone wears it. Tell them the story behind it." It's the weirdest thing. Cleo barely got the sentence out before the two of them broke up laughing. Valentina said, "Be serious." I am. I laughed even though I wasn't in on the joke and assumed I very much was the joke. I dropped the mask and it flopped onto the tabletop. You guys are fucking with me. You had me going. They assured me they were not. I asked why they were laughing, which made them laugh harder. Valentina finally said, "Because Cleo is going to tell you about the mask, or what Cleo is going to tell you about the mask will sound bonkers, but it's the truth." Cleo spun her tale. The Rhode Island town in which they grew up had experienced precipitous population decline after mill closings in the 60s and 70s, so the town had consolidated its 3 elementary schools into 2. The abandoned McKay Elementary School, the same one they would be using as one of the locations for the movie, became a not-so-secret hangout for high school kids on Friday and Saturday nights. Cleo, Valentina, and another friend, Carson, who was also going to be in the movie, explored the place on Sunday mornings or after school when they could have the place to themselves. Cleo went alone sometimes, usually during the summer. She sat in the different classrooms and wrote short stories, nothing more than a paragraph or two, about a student or a teacher she imagined had once been in the room. Upon returning home from college and knowing Valentina was planning Planning to make short films and possibly a full-length movie, Cleo wanted to write a screenplay that would make use of the school. Last spring, for the first time in years, she returned to the school looking for story inspiration. In one of the classrooms on the second floor, the remaining student desks, most of which had been mangled and smashed, were piled in the center of the room. It was bright outside, but not a lot of light filtered through the milky cataract windows. The room was dusky. If she squinted, the desk pile looked like a thicket of denuded branches. Ringed within the rubble, a shadowed lump jutted from the floor. It looked like a head. She circled the desks, looking closer, trying to convince herself it wasn't a head. But the more she looked, the more she was sure it was a head. And there, by herself in an empty room, in an abandoned school, in a dying town, in a dying world, she thought she saw eyes, and she thought she saw them blink. At this point in her story, Cleo was laughing, but it was a different kind of laughing. There are so many kinds of laughter, aren't there? She described her panicked flight from the school, the knocks and slaps of her own fleeting footsteps, not daring to breathe until she left the building. And when she was outside, the world appeared changed by what she had seen. Cleo corrected herself. Of course, the world wasn't changed. And here, for the only time in her tale, she stammered, searching for the right words. The world was the same, but a new part of it had been revealed. Even if what she found wasn't a head, the world was indeed a place in which she might find one. She didn't tell anyone what she saw, at least not until she showed Valentina her first draft of the screenplay a few weeks later. Upon returning to her childhood home, her bedroom, she spent the afternoon and that evening and the next morning convincing herself she didn't see a head, and if it was a head, it wasn't a real head. And by real, she meant a head that was once atop a living body, and that this not real head didn't have eyes that blinked. She returned to the school the next day, after work, and instead of her notebook, she brought a flashlight, long and heavy enough to be a cudgel. Cleo stood at the base of the cement stairs and looked up at the brick building, at how big it was, and then she stared at the slitted mouth of the propped open door and remembered the emptiness inside the building and how awful and wonderful it had felt to be alone within the emptiness. So she crept back into the school, listening for sounds that were no longer there, for sounds that would be heard by no one but her. With that kind of reverence in her heart, she walked up the stairs to the second floor in that classroom at the other end of the hall, where everything was where it was, where it had been. She said sorry out loud to no one and turned on the flashlight, which rudely burned away the murkiness and exposed the head as a mask. She supposed there still could be a head under the mask, hiding its true face, but she didn't think that was the case. And she admitted it was weirdly disappointing to no longer believe it was a real head. I didn't think it was weird, and I told her so. Cleo pulled apart the desk pile until there was a path to its center. There was no blood on the floor, no neck drippings. We all giggled at her phrase, neck drippings. She tapped the mask with her flashlight, and it toppled over, exposing a white neck or base. Later, when she was home, she carefully removed the mask from the featureless styrofoam head. The foam was mealy under her fingers, sloughing off and disintegrating at her touch. The schoolroom floor within the ring of desks was extra dusty and grainy with foam granules. The tile under the head was all scratched up, and the longer she looked, the more certain she became that the scratches were purposeful. Since she was taking the mask and would write a story using it, Cleo decided to leave some sort of offering, something of herself, in its stead. A gift for a gift. She pushed and piled dust over the floor scratches. Then she wrote what she thought would be the first line of her screenplay into the dust. When she brought Valentina to the schoolroom a month later, the desks were still there, but what she had written in the dust had been smoothed away. I didn't believe her story about finding the mask, and I said so multiple times. Valentina and Cleo both insisted Cleo was telling the truth. I wondered aloud if what they were telling me was a scene from their movie. Valentina said that they contemplated incorporating the discovery of the mask into the screenplay, but had decided against it, opting to leave its origin mysterious. I picked up the mask and inspected it some more. I'd never seen anything exactly like it, but it also wasn't wholly unfamiliar. I assumed they'd made it, and I said that I thought they were going. I said that I thought they were giving me this cursed masked legend to inform the performance. Valentina and Cleo spoke at the same time. Who said anything about a curse? I never used the word curse. I said, well, assuming this is legit, any lost object is cursed. Isn't the mask a found object? And cursed by what? Valentina asked. I shrugged, and it was my turn to stammer and stumble through saying not quite what I wanted to say or mean. Maybe some of us make movies because words so often fail us. I don't know. I guess cursed by whatever happened to it, to make it lost. Cleo said the mask wasn't lost. It was left there on purpose. Sounds even more cursed to me, I said and chuckled. No one laughed. I hoped they would. During the 15 years after filming and prior to the 2008 leaked images and scenes, I haunted costume shops and made countless deep dive online searches, but I never found another mask that looked exactly like that one. It's not there.
Oh, glad you picked that to read. That's such a cool scene. That was the scene I was talking about.
Thank you.
Where it really just opens. it opened. You could take it in so many directions from there, and even like with you saying, like, yeah, is that he even questions it, even if that was a real story.
Right.
As you were reading it, I was thinking like, it's an impossible thing to choose, but yeah, given a choice, would you put for either for reading or for writing, would you want the origin in your do you like prefer your breakfast with the origin of thing or without?
I mean, honestly, I feel like it's story dependent.
Yeah.
Like I certainly don't want to ever like default to ambiguity, which I'm sure I'm certainly accused of at times. But I mean, it's clearly an interest of mine, and it sort of leaks in there almost by itself. But at the same time, like I really try to make sure if a story is going to employ ambiguity, I think that's the best way to tell the story. I could be wrong. I'm sure I'm wrong all the time.
Oh no, I hear you on that for sure. I mean, you're preaching to the choir with the ambiguity, but yeah, I know maybe perhaps more in horror movies that's more of a dirty word perhaps than in.
Yeah. So like, I mean, let's go back to Texas Chainsaw. Like, you don't know the origin of this family. They're just there, right? I mean, you see hints of sort of the family setup. You've got the almost dead grandfather and and everything else. And I mean, that makes to me that makes that whole setup like way more scary. Like, I don't need like the Texas Chainsaw at the beginning or whatever. The full explanation of of the family. It's funny that so many people almost like universally say, "Oh yeah, like when in a horror movie when something's off screen, it's almost always scarier when it's off screen than when you finally see it again." So like, I don't understand why so many people insist on like having like an explanation for everything. Yeah,
two different flavors. I mean, I could go both ways, and like you, I intentionally. I mean, I'm just so. It's not. I don't think it's the majority flavor. And once I realized that Robert Aikman was a thing, I was just. I intentionally, once I realized it was a thing and became more controlled, I default towards that. And obviously, you said you don't want to sacrifice story, but just because it's August, I'm not sure if you saw Alien Romulus.
Not yet.
But I won't. Well, I won't spoil a thing. But going back to 1979's Alien, the biggest and best mystery, in any horror movie, the space jockey. Of just seeing that. And Alien's a movie that has both that sense of horror and body horror and a sense of wonder. That was a sense of wonder to me, because it was like this unfathomable, the Geiger designs, and we had enough where we could make a conjecture about what that was, but we never got the origin. And I'm so I just feel like it was a massive. For me, I could have been content to have that mystery stay with me forever. And, I'm of the school where like it like pained me like a I don't know what pain, like Prometheus and Covenant really hurt me, without maligning anyone and without maligning any decisions. It's just talking about like storytelling decisions of just like, wow, that was a decision I wouldn't have made. Just to say that.
Yeah, I'm able to brick over things in my brain that I like, what, I'm just gonna forget that exists and remember.
Yeah, I did that the other day. I went back and rewatched them and was like, let me pretend that I don't feel this way and try to enjoy it, get into it. But it was an intellectual experience. It was not my natural. It was my natural thing. But again, no spoilers. We talked about. I mentioned very briefly. There's the movie the movie talked to me without saying anything more than it is an object story.
Mhm.
It felt like it was, and I enjoyed that movie very much, but it felt like it was a movie and a story that was very aware of itself, and that it didn't give the origin of that object. But I felt like it was so aware of itself, where like if that's going to be a franchise or a sequel, that maybe filmmakers nowadays, it almost feels like where you can plug it in, where you can see like there's movies, right? So like maybe if you didn't have that bit, or if a horror movie, the novel becomes horror movie, the movie, and horror movie, the movie becomes a franchise. You can see, right? You can see like where that object, where if it's a mask censored thing, where it can be compartmentalized or plugged in,
right.
and we can judge them all we want.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's probably like a line somewhere. I mean, obviously explanations are great, like if it's called for, and there are times where I think hiding the origin, like I think the Space Jockey is a perfect example. By hiding the origin of that, like that mystery is like a both conscious and subconscious reminder that we are not in control. Like we don't know what this thing is, and that's a very powerful thing in horror. But at the same time, like if you're gonna, you can't have like the mysterious mask keep showing up and keep showing up. At some point, people are gonna be like, well, why is this thing? There's only you can only string along folks so long.
Maybe you could. Maybe it's just
yeah, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, like, and then again, I read. I was like, what? I think you could, but that's just me. That's probably why I'm not a Hollywood. I'm not a Hollywood producer.
Sure,
but
right.
I was going down the rabbit hole of seeing, like, apparently I learned that Ridley Scott hated the alien queen in James Cameron's Aliens, and he's like, I'm gonna come up with my own origin for the life cycle. And I was like, okay, but enough about Alien. Another structural thing that's unique about your work. I'm not so sure what the term of it is, but you either it's referencing something or foreshadowing something or mentioning something. In an interview, you said, and a lot you were aware of it in a recent interview. You said, a lot of my stories telegraph something that happens in the climax or 2/3 through the way down the book. For example, in horror movie, we know from the get-go that this is a doomed movie. We know from the get-go that something, without saying what it is that goes wrong, that something has gone terribly wrong with the movie and it was never released. Obviously it was due to something horrible going wrong on set. So there's there's both a lot of tension there of the reader. That's why I guess when I said pace and we changed it to motion, there's a lot of gravity towards that moment. And then you also mentioned that all your scenes were serving something. You said, I just wrote this by the feel, and I wanted every bit to make sense. And I was saying, well, I think you were saying you wanted it to all make sense. It was all serving that unity of that moment, of that point. So you intentionally put yourself in a box, or authors intentionally put themselves in a box that is often reserved for like sequels or prequels. And that box is, how do you make a good movie or good narrative when the reader or viewer knows from the beginning the outcome? And I think that's a really hard box. And the best example I could think of where it was navigated successfully was the show Better Call Saul. Have you seen Better Call Saul?
I haven't.
Where we know. Oh, you haven't seen it?
Yeah. No, I haven't. I know of it. You can spoil it. It's fine. Well,
we just know a certain character. We know Anakin becomes Darth Vader. One character. Right. We know one character becomes a different character. So we know that, but we just don't know. We just don't know why or the how. So, like, in the same way you've done it with horror movie, you're like, this film is doomed, and this film, people don't survive it, but you don't get it till a point. So how did how do you? I was going to say, how do you feel about that? Obviously, you must like it because you said you do it a lot. And then how do you accomplish that, or what do you think about it now that you've recognized it as a pattern in your work? Is that is it conscious? So you said this one wasn't mapped out. Was that mapped out in other stories, or?
It depends on the story, but I think maybe something like that crystallized a little bit with The Cabinet at the End of the World. And it's funny, you and I you mentioned oddity before we started recording, like was a, a
Yeah,
Hitchcockian approach to horror.
yeah.
And so like I thought, especially for Cabin, where I felt like that was like the first like thrillery thing I was messing around with. But anyway, I was thinking about Hitchcock's. I'm going to butcher it, but I'll get it mostly correct. His definition of suspense, right? Like a bomb exploding under a table. He said was thrilling. That's a thrilling moment. It's exciting. But he said suspense is the bomb
Ah,
having not gone off under the table, and even further, the readers or the viewers know it's there. So it's just like it feels like a very natural way to have like all this tension. So purposefully in horror movie, I definitely wanted to drag out like, hey,
mm,
something terrible happens to prevent this from being being filmed. And I slowly leak out like information where you learn that it's Cleo is the one who hasn't survived the set. um you know and hopefully the thing I was most worried about was like getting, well, is the reveal going to be unsatisfying? That was something I worried about. And hopefully it's not. And the other worry after that was the chapter
always
after
isn't that
that was like,
always the
oh god,
isn't that always the worry, right? Like, like can your when you have such a great setup, like and maybe that is a function. I know I'm going back that you hate the word pace, but like,
yeah,
yeah, like maybe if you hold it, and I don't know the answer to it, but it has to feel right. Like you have to hold that bomb reveal for just the right amount for it to feel satisfying.
yeah. Well,
And
I mean, so like
I
if
think you certainly hit it. It
well,
certainly
thank
feels
you.
satisfying. People love the book, but and you've written it. I guess in that way you can say that this is a Hitchcockian book because it certainly fits that pattern of you answered the question of like how do you do it? Well, yeah, you show the reader and the reader knows, and you inch them closer and closer to it, just the right amount to be fun and not annoying.
I mean, because it is fun. Like when the reader knows, then they think like, oh, they know exactly how it's going to happen. And then if you do manage to do something that's unexpected, I think that as a reader for me, or as a, if we're watching a movie as a viewer, that's, that's an exciting, that's when plot is exciting. Cause frankly, like I tend to be, this is probably not a surprise to some people, that plot is like one of the things I'm least interested in. Uh, and I find that I have the hardest time with as a writer. I'm much more drawn to sort of voice and character and atmosphere and stuff like that. Um, yeah,
There's two joys. There's two joys as to revealing what you said there. You revel in the where the expectation is subverted or is different than going down the pipe, and I think there's two joys in that. I'm also with you where I'm so much more excited as a reader where I feel that bottom coming out from under me, or I feel like the expectation has been subverted.
yeah,
So I enjoy that, but I also know that some people, that's a real dirty word, and they really don't like that. They like the first position or the
mhm,
vanilla, so they like to like, oh, that's where you sometimes you see people widely differing on movies, mostly maybe A24 movies. Like probably my favorite movie of recent time might be It Follows, and so many people are like, I love that movie, especially the ending, and so many people are like, great movie until the ending. Like, and a lot of times
mhm,
things it shows you how people diverge on
yeah,
whether they want it to be rewarded for knowing it or whether they reveling in the subversion of expectation.
right. I love It Falls as well. Yeah, the ending isn't perfect, but I don't hate the ending. I
I
mean,
love
the pool ending is fine. I love the ending. I love that, like after the pool. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I love that. I love everything about it. But yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's a movie that illustrates, and I'm not judging anyone on it, but it's a movie that illustrates people's tastes in what they like, and that's
right.
perfectly so. It's perfectly fine, like even like the marketing of The Witch. I remember Eggers The Witch when it came out, people were marketing that this is the scariest movie ever, and like yeah. It's a movie that I do love, and yeah, it's scarier, and that like yeah, the institutions that are supposed to support you
Yeah,
are misogynistic and will not save you. I'm like, that is the scariest ever. But people were like, where is it? Where was the Blair Witch aspect, or where was that? But speaking of types of horror movie, in addition to doing all these somewhat intellectual things, but there's also the body horror aspect of it.
mm,
I'm going to say it's got the misery. I can't stop referencing Stephen King. It's got the misery moment or the misery aspect to it. Um, and but you've explored. We know that this is going to happen. We know that there's something body horror is going to happen, but it's explored in all the ways before it happens. We have like different time periods. There's like a convention. You give us the main character, the tall kid, is at a different writing conventions or horror conventions. This might cut a little too close to home, but for some of us who've been to too many of those. Just going so deep down the Stephen King rabbit hole, there's one point where I believe that the tall kid is talking. They're talking about it. I think it might be with Valentina when he goes back to visit Valentina about what should appear in art. And I think this is when they were talking about it, both in the present and talking about it, saying like what. And I think the tall kid comes right out and says, this is one of these dark fatalistic things. He's like, I think that life is dark, and these things, no matter how upsetting, should appear in art and not be off limits. And that's a rough concept when it comes down to something that hurts you or hurts me. But it's amusing. I tend to agree with. Horror movie takes place. I think even the characters reference it, that it takes place pre-Columbine,
right?
Pre mass shooting epidemic, which makes me think of Stephen King's Rage, which Stephen King has chosen to take out of print and keep out of print. Is it a question of some things, not that they should or shouldn't be, but maybe it's just some things that we just don't do, right? Like now, like the Running Man used a plane as a weapon against a skyscraper, which just has eerie relevance to our world. Like, what about that? Are there some things you wouldn't do, or
are there
something that
absolutely
we don't do, even if
I mean, I have my own personal lines, but I wouldn't put those lines in other people, because it's usually, my lines involve like, thankfully I have no experience with being sexually abused or anything like that. So I don't feel comfortable writing about that, but I totally understand writers who have had that misfortune wanting to write about it and needing to write about it, and totally would defend the artist's right to do that. 100%. I mean, it's a little bit sort of glib to say like, I don't think there's any lines off limit. I mean, if it feels like it's exploitive, then I think that means that it failed as art. But that's so hard to define, like when something
and it could fail, and one person's failure can be another person's success. I mean, as we're getting ready to wrap it up, but going back to where we started with the early 90s music, it just made me think of, Billy Corgan maybe was one of the first rock stars to talk about his sexual abuse and talk about it in a song, and to some people that's going to be triggering, but maybe to another group of people that can be empowering.
I would just say tie a bow on it, but Mariana Enriquez was, one of my favorite people and writers. She did a couple of interviews with the New York Times within the past year, two, and I would invite people to read both of those because she talks about the question of violence in art, specifically because her novel Our Share of Night, takes place during the Dirty War, where thousands and thousands of people were killed and disappeared by their despotic government. And she talked about, for her, like the role of violence was like she wanted to return this awful, terrible stuff, return it from being the quotidian of actually real life and putting it back in horror kind of thing, almost like trying to almost close a Pandora's box in a way. But she also, I sort of cribbed quoting her by saying, hey, there's violence in our life, there's going to be violence in our art. It's sort of really inescapable.
Wow, I haven't read that novel because I'm so fascinated. I love her short stories. She just might be the best there is right now.
And she has a new collection coming out in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
I can't wait. Her work is if anyone in earshot of this has not read her work, I highly recommend it. It
Absolutely.
Is just so good. Couple of things in Brian Evanson edited an issue of McSweeney's, has a relatively new Mariana Enrique's story that it recommended. And I'm also mentioning it because it has a Stephen Graham Jones short story or novella in it that takes another sort of meta approach to the horror movie and the horror genre. If you haven't read it, I don't think you've read it yet, Paul.
I haven't. Yeah.
But just recommending it to our listeners. If you liked horror movie, check that out by Stephen Graham Jones. Before I do a couple of plugs to shout outs to some friends of the show, the one Easter egg, or maybe it's not so much of an Easter egg, I wanted to ask you about in horror movie was at one point Cleo. It comes in a really tough scene. I think it's the closet scene, which is where one of those scenes. I think Cleo says she quotes a character from Peter Straub's Coco.
Yeah.
So she says, I'm gonna mangle the quote, but she says, "Oh, I wanted to say the killer is talking about demons," and the quote was like, "Oh, demons are made to love and be loved," and that's what something the killer says. What does that quote mean to you, or in the context of Coco, or in the context?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of. I felt like it fit the moment of giving of not giving a full explanation as to why they're doing this to the thin kid in the movie, and leaving it somewhat mysterious. And just even to make the reader step back and be like, "What do you mean? Like they're doing this terrible stuff to him out of love? Like, you don't typically associate love, with horror, but of course, if we're gonna get like, I don't know, Greek philosophical, like if there's too much love, it veers off into vice or something. I don't know. I'm not a very good philosophy major, but like, I happened to reread Coco, I think, when I was writing the book. And so Peter obviously passed away by the time this book was completed. He was someone I had the pleasure of getting to know in the last decade of his life, and was one of the the greatest thrills of my writing sort of career that I did get to know Peter a little bit.
It's such a masterpiece of so much depth to come back to it again and again. What a joy to read that book.
So I wanted in some small way just to honor Peter. And for me, he's like one of those writers who I almost, not every book, but almost every book, like I'll read it the first time and I'll be like, I don't know. But then when I go back and read a second time, I'm like, holy crap. Like, how does he do it?
You hit it right on the head. I came to Peter Straub and I was way too young. I just wasn't mature enough to really get it. So I come back and reread, and I do have that experience of like just seeing the levels and the masterfulness of it, especially Coco.
Yeah.
So it's great. Yeah, I was going to say, like, you don't even need an answer. Like, why not? If the answer was, we just wanted to put something in there to honor the great Peter Straub, like, why not have a Peter Straub Easter egg? I just want to mention a couple of friends of the show before I ask you where people can connect with you.
Sure.
But I wanted to have a shout out to the Horror in the High Desert podcast hosted by Scotty Mildner. He's got an episode coming up September 3rd with editor Tom Deedy and artist Lynn Hansen, and various authors in an upcoming short fiction anthology, The Rack. September 6th, he's got Ray Wild and C.S. Humble. October 4th, N.J. Gallegos, and October 18th, C.J. Lead. So, it's a great podcast. Check out Scotty Mildner's Horror in the High Desert. I also wanted to give a shout out to Mike Allen. Mike Allen's got a new short story collection of cosmic horror. It's called Slow Burn, which forms a trilogy with his earlier collections of short stories. It's his newest short story collection. It's got cosmic horror, some Lynchian stuff in there, and it's up by author Mike Allen. My plug is my latest story is called Where the Jaguar King Lives in the Dark Heart of the Wood, and you can find that in Nightmare Abbey #6. That's edited by Tom English, and we've got an Ian Rogers short story in there, and a column by Matt Cowan. Paul, what are you working on now? Are you just catching your breath, or are you always working? What's next for you that you want to let us know about? Or
so next summer, I just turned in the copy edits. I have a short novel about 50,000 words, but it's a middle grade novel, and it's called Another. It wasn't sort of like a planned career pivot. Like to me, in my mind, this is a one-off, unless I happen to have like another idea. But it's just a story from the point of view of a 12-year-old kid. So I was like, I just sort of went with it. Now I'm very for something that started off as a little bit of a lark, like I'm just going to try it, it became like an important thing to write for me because even though there's a
Mhm.
lot of weird stuff that happens in it, including like this sort of like living clay boy that stays with this very lonely, 12-year-old for a few days. Uh, it sort of became, I didn't know it was going to become this, but it became a way to write about the 2 years I taught in masks in a high school and what the students sort of went through. So yeah, I'm
What did you say?
hopeful.
You said the 2 years you taught what?
The 2 years that during the pandemic where I was teaching in a mask, uh, essentially, like,
Oh,
yeah. So,
okay.
uh,
And that answers my question. I was going to say, why was it?
yeah.
If you would tell
Oh
us
yeah,
what it's
not
important
not
about,
a
but
different kind of cursed mask. Yeah.
I was going to say it
So,
brings our whole conversation, a whole different light to our conversation.
yeah. No,
Can you imagine
yeah,
that having Paul Tremblay like today in the Cursed Mass 101 taught by
yeah.
Paul Tremblay? Thank you
Uh,
so much, Paul. I look forward to seeing that. That sounds like a great
Thank you.
book.
Yeah.
Congratulations again on Horror Movie. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, stay tuned. Stay in while I disconnect this and say thank you
Thank
to
you.
our readers.
Yeah.
And yeah, everybody pick up Horror Movie and all of Paul Tremblay's great books. And we'll see you next time for our conversation with Brian Evanson.
Oh,
Take
exciting.
care, everyone.
Yeah.